When you sit down and think about buying a pre-built gaming PC, the first thing that usually pops into your head is that uneasy feeling of, am I really getting something that will actually serve me, or am I just paying for a pretty case and a logo? I've been there more than once, especially when I'm trying to balance the desire for decent performance with a budget that isn't limitless. You end up scouring forums, watching a dozen YouTubers, and still wondering whether the specs on the page translate to a smooth experience in the real world. That's why in this review I'm going to walk through exactly what the Skytech Shadow Gaming Desktop brings to the table, where it shines, and where it might leave you wishing you'd spent a little more or a little less. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, let's talk about the core of any gaming rig, the CPU and GPU. The Shadow comes with an AMD Ryzen 7 5700X paired with an NVIDIA RTX 4060. On paper, the 5700X's 3.4 GHz base clock and 4.6 GHz boost, together with the 4060's 8 GB of GDDR6X memory, put this machine squarely in the mid to high-end range for 1080p to 1440p gaming. In practice, that combination means you can comfortably run titles like Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 2 or Elden Ring at high settings, hitting around 7080 frames per second at 1440p without any noticeable dips. If you're the type who likes to keep the frame rate locked at 60 frames per second while streaming on Twitch, the CPU's 8 cores give you enough headroom to encode video and keep the game smooth at the same time. That's a practical strength that many entry-level builds lack. People often buy a cheap CPU and then discover their streaming software strains the system. The storage setup is another area where the Shadow does something you don't see a lot in pre-built PCs. A 1TB NVMe SSD means you're not only getting fast load times, you actually have room for a decent game library. I've seen buyers complain that a 256 or 512 GB drive fills up after a month of new releases. That's an inconvenience that forces you to uninstall and reinstall games just to make space. With a full terabyte, you can keep Fortnite, Valorant, and a handful of AAA titles installed simultaneously, which is a real convenience for anyone who likes to hop between games without waiting for installations. Now, the case and cooling. Skytech's Shadow uses a black tempered glass chassis that looks sleek on a desk, and it comes with 4 RGB ring fans arranged to push air through a 240mm AIO liquid cooler. The visual appeal is nice, but more importantly the airflow design does keep the CPU temperatures in a comfortable range, typically hovering around 60°C under load, and rarely spiking above 70°C even during long gaming sessions. That means you won't be dealing with thermal throttling after an hour of Cyberpunk 2077 or a marathon raid in World of Warcraft. The downside is that the case is a bit on the compact side, so if you're planning to add a lot of extra drives or large aftermarket coolers, you'll need to be mindful of space constraints. It's not a deal breaker, but it does limit future expansion if you ever want to upgrade beyond the 16 GB of RAM that ships with the system. Speaking of memory, the 16 GB DDR4 at 3200 MHz is more than enough for current gaming standards. Most modern titles run comfortably with 12 GB, and the extra 4 GB provides a cushion for background tasks like web browsing, voice chat, or a second instance of recording software. The only practical weakness here is that the RAM is soldered to the motherboard in a way that makes upgrades a bit more involved than in a typical DIY build. You can still add more, but you'll need to open the case and possibly replace the existing sticks, which can be daunting if you're not comfortable with hardware tinkering. Connectivity is where the Shadow ticks a few boxes that often get overlooked. It includes built-in 802.11 AC Wi-Fi, which is handy if your gaming setup is far from the router or you don't want the clutter of Ethernet cables. The downside, however, is that it only offers a single HDMI output and a handful of USB-A ports, no USB-C or multiple display ports. If you run a dual monitor setup or plan to use a VR headset that requires specific connections, you'll need to invest in adapters or a docking station. That's a small extra cost that buyers should be aware of before they click buy. Who should consider the Skytech Shadow? If you're a gamer with a moderate budget, say, around $1,200 to $1,500, and you want a ready-to-play machine that can handle most modern titles at 1080p or 1440p without you having to assemble anything, this is a solid contender. It's especially appealing to streamers who need a CPU that can handle both gaming and encoding, and to people who value a quick, hassle-free startup. You plug it in, power it on, and Windows 11 Home loads already configured without the bloatware that some other pre-built brands